when I'm working with somebody one-on-one, I like to feel out sort of as I hear them tracking what their sense of a good take and a bad take is. What kind of thing do they hear as a mistake? There's such a huge continuum of that. Some people are so nitpicky about inconsistencies and other people couldn't care less. So I like to not really like assume that they're going to be one way or the other and let them take the lead on that when I can.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, this is Colin Marston.
And Colin, you and I have never been formally introduced. I've seen Krallice a few times. I've seen Gorguts a few times. We've been in the same room a few times when I was living in New York and seeing shows. But your name comes up quite a bit on this podcast when I speak to bands about the recording and technical aspects of recording their music. As far as that side of what you do, how would you describe your role? Do you call yourself a producer? Do you call yourself an engineer?
I suppose I call myself both. In the past, I feel like I wasn't ever sort of officially called a producer. And so I was a little careful to refer to myself that way. I think I would usually just be more specific about when dealing with credits and say something like recorded and mixed or mastered by Colin, and not really deal with the whole engineering versus production labeling thing. In more recent years, I've become a little more comfortable calling myself a producer because I realize I more or less am for most of my own band's records that I make, just sort of by default. And I also have over the years delved into, I think, a lot of things which would be more traditionally considered producery roles with some of the bands I work with, where I'm actually writing music on top of their album and playing it, contributing in that sense, or coming up with arrangement ideas for a band song that involve, an instrumentation or a way of playing, which, is an idea coming from me. So that ends up being collaborative. And there's been even times where people sort of like ask me to produce in one aspect or another. We have to recognize how nebulous a term production and producer can be. It really can sort of mean anything.
Right. And I think, in terms of how nebulous it is, I listened to a podcast recently where the title was, "What Does Rick Rubin Do?" What exactly does Rick Rubin do?
Right.
And Rick Rubin is, a big name producer, but also has his own studio, also works with a number of engineers and reportedly, I don't know how true this is, but is basically only in his own studio maybe a day a week. And so there's a lot of, I think, confusion or maybe misinformation about what producers actually do.
Well, am I wrong in that too? He doesn't mix like at all, right? I mean, he helps with the songwriting process and making decisions about the recording and so on, but he doesn't actually do any of the technical part of recording. Yeah.
And I think, especially within our little world, I think people are used to thinking of a producer as somebody like Thomas Skogsberg, who's, or maybe even Scott Burns, who I spoke to a few years ago,
mm-hmm.
who are associated with a certain sound, and so people go to them for that sound. And both those guys were very hands-on in terms of the engineering side. But I think,
sure, exactly. Yeah, they both mixed. Or actually, I don't know the first person you mentioned, but Scott Burns, obviously.
Yeah. And, and so I think there's maybe the idea that a producer is the guy you go to if, you're looking for, a certain guitar tone or, just basically like, the magic touch that somebody like Andy Wallace or somebody like that would bring to an album.
Right. Although I think, even Andy Wallace does a lot of this. He's an interesting person to bring up because he, mixed Nevermind and the classic Slayer records and so on, but he did not produce any of those albums.
Right. Yeah.
He did produce other albums. I'm pretty sure. I was just listening to an interview with him recently. I think he produced Jeff Buckley, I believe, and like recorded that record and produced it. But I think it's so interesting when people are credited with producing something which they just record. And that an example of that would be Nevermind, where Butch Vig is credited as the producer, but he just recorded the album. Same with the classic Metallica albums, produced by Fleming Rasmussen. He didn't mix any of those records.
Right, yeah.
They were all mixed by different people. So yeah, it's really interesting what ends up being called a producer and what they actually end up doing on a record. And it can really mean anything. It can mean you tracked it. It can mean you helped the songwriting process. It can mean you mixed it and mastered it and helped, write the music, just anything really.
And you've taken on a lot of these different roles that we've spoken about. You've mastered albums, you've remastered albums, you've mixed albums, and you've engineered albums. But when it comes to bands who used to come into your studio, you were very hands-on when it came to like setting up the mics and working the board and all that stuff, right?
Sure, always, yeah. I've always been the only person doing that for my recordings.
And so when you say you're becoming more comfortable with the term of music producer, what does that term mean to you now?
Well, now that I think about it, it's sort of like I was saying. I feel like it can literally just mean any part of the process, and I pretty much do every part of the process, sometimes on a given record or sometimes a piece of the process. But I think it just took me a long time to realize that that's what it means to me, and therefore I do it.
Right. Okay.
And also I've just ended up with that credit on some other people's records, not even something we talked about. And so I'm kind of like, yeah, all right, sure. Yeah, I guess I consider that I do that sometimes and other people do. So I guess that's something I do.
Yeah. Some people look to an engineer or producer as somebody who's literally just there to capture their vision.
Mm-hmm.
And some people look to a producer to almost shape the sound in ways that they may not know exactly what they want
Right.
100%. And some people want somebody who will be almost like a coach for an athletic team,
Mm-hmm.
who's pushing them on the performance side. Is that all stuff that comes under your purview as a producer?
I suppose so, although I can say that I think on average, my perception is on average for working with metal bands, which is like very on average, like intricate, involved, dense music where the playing aspect of it is at the forefront of the process of recording, more so than a lot of other kinds of music. Maybe not classical, but a lot of other kinds of music, it's less of an emphasis. So in that sense, sometimes I help with coaching of the actual playing, but I think way less than a lot of other engineers or producers or whatever you want to call them, in the sense that I think in metal, there's often a sense of like right and wrong and correct and incorrect and tight and untight. There's in modern metal recording, that's one of the kinds of music that's common to have like things be on a grid and quantized and sound replaced and all these kinds of intense methods to clean up the performance. And I am not a fan of all those kinds of things. Never say never, but in general, that's a kind of the engineering and recording process that I don't really relate to and don't have a lot of experience doing. I tend to, in terms of the quality of a performance, I like to default to the opinion of the band whenever I can. I think it's kind of ridiculous for me, my opinion of how tight or sloppy someone else's musicianship should be a major factor in whether or not something gets used on the record. So when I'm working with somebody one-on-one, I like to feel out sort of as I hear them tracking what their sense of a good take and a bad take is. What kind of thing do they hear as a mistake? There's such a huge continuum of that. Some people are so nitpicky about inconsistencies and other people couldn't care less. So I like to not really like assume that they're going to be one way or the other and let them take the lead on that when I can.
Right. So I'd like to circle back to your history, your personal history in terms of writing and playing and then ultimately producing this music. I grew up in a period where a lot of, including some of the guys that I mentioned, a lot of the people responsible for recording this music were not themselves death metal musicians
Mm-hmm.
or black metal musicians. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so there was always, I feel, a remove between what they're capturing and maybe like what their sense of what the music is.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a lot of what I think is kind of interesting about early metal recordings, where there wasn't much established of how it should sound yet. So you're dealing with a lot of engineers who, aren't musicians in the genre, maybe aren't musicians at all, and really don't have an understanding of what the band is doing. And you end up getting a lot of awkward sounding recordings, but in the awkwardness is a lot of really interesting, weird decisions made.
Right.
Which can be, fun.
Yeah. And now we're in an era where, it's not just guys like you and Greg Wilkinson who are, musicians and extremely involved in the writing and performance of metal, but also, guys like Chris Gregg from Woe.
Mm-hmm.
And, almost every band has a member who is also an engineer or can handle that side of things. And so the recordings are now coming from a very personal space where, people are very intimately involved in and have a clear idea of what they want their music to sound like.
Yeah, I suppose it's a lot more common to have someone in the band engineering the band's recordings or mixing or doing whatever part of the album making process these days, just because of the cheapness and accessibility of of recording gear. So yeah, it's like, every amateur engineer or whatever you want to call it in every band before, like, didn't have access to actually like make a sort of professional sounding album from start to finish. But now that that's a possibility, you see that way more often for sure. And it's great. I mean, it's so cool to have someone in the band help actually establish the recorded sonic vision of it, because who would know better than that person what they want it to sound like?
Yeah. But I also, I had a weird thought yesterday when I was thinking back to the way, my personal preconceptions of what this music is supposed to sound like started with listening to the albums. But then when I myself was playing the music in bands and jamming and stuff like that, it never sounded like that. And there's always a disconnect of like, wait, why don't we sound as good as Cannibal Corpse?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I actually wonder if, like, I don't know. I mean, do you think like the bands themselves sometimes were, like pulling a reference from the top of my head, somebody like Carcass, who were very unhappy with their first album,
which is by the way one of the most amazing sounding records of all time. That's actually I was kind of thinking
and
about
most
that
influential,
when I
right? Like
when I brought that up. What were we saying?
Yeah. Well, just were they maybe like because they're so young when they did it, a little bit naive, or didn't realize that that's exactly what they sounded like?
Right. Yeah, it's a clearly sort of an unaware-ish sound, but also just like an inability to know what to do to realize the sound they had in their head, probably.
Right, yeah.
Which is a lot of the beauty of like music made by kids, Beharit and all the, just hilariously weird and sloppy and strange sounding recordings of very young musicians doing, kind of like super ambitious things that they can't quite realize.
So let's circle back to your personal history. What was the point where you realized that music was something you wanted to pursue as a career, in terms of first making music and being a musician, and then later on recording it and being an engineer and a producer?
Well, I suppose whether or not it lines up with reality, I have never really actually thought of myself as having a music career. I have, I suppose, thought of myself having a career as a recording engineer because early on, like, high school years, I suppose, I sort of had it in my head that that's what I would do for work, since I never considered being a musician as a profession. It just always seemed sort of ridiculously risky and full of all sorts of compromises. And from day one, I was making more or less the kind of music I still make, some sort of weird, dark ambient prog stuff. And so, music that would never be sort of commercial. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, yeah, early on, like, I figured, like, I need some sort of like a real job to do, and in music, something related to recording is made sense to me and was something I could sort of stomach.
I think that's an interesting point that you brought up. The progressive and the synth stuff that you were listening to, because if I'm not mistaken, as much as you're associated with progressive death metal and extreme music and this world, you actually came to it from a different place, right? You came to it from more of a progressive side.
For sure, yeah. So I didn't really grow up with metal, with the exception of Metallica. But I actually kind of had. I never really had anyone around me that was like a metalhead growing up. So I think all I knew of metal was sort of glam and pop metal that was on TV in the 80s growing up and early 90s. So, but when I first started playing guitar and started playing music at, I think around age 12, something like that, the music that I was really interested in quickly became 70s prog and classical music. So that's really the music that I was excited about when I first started making music, and carried me through, my kind of high school years. And then it wasn't until maybe I was like 17 or so that I started hearing this extreme metal stuff when I met Kevin Huffnagel, who I play with in Dysrhythmia, and Gorguts, and my other friend Alex Nagel, who's another amazing guitar player and musician. And those guys showed me all sorts of weird, sort of abstruse death metal and black metal, and that's kind of, I was like, oh, okay, there's this in metal, and that was what got me hooked on metal, and then I sort of went from there as like a late teenager.
Yeah. And that's actually something that I think a lot of people miss about metal. I mean, not so much these days, but I think in the period that we grew up, when a lot of the stuff was considered just noise, which was the musicianship was always extremely high. And, whatever you thought about the vocals or the lyrical content or the imagery or whatever, I think people who came from, a more musical side could see that, what the music was, what these bands were playing was extremely difficult.
Yeah.
It wasn't just kids making noise. Was that part of what appealed to you about extreme metal?
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is, because I feel like I came to it, I think of it in my head as coming to extreme metal late, whatever, early for some, late for others. But by that point, I was already very familiar with musicianship. And, I was like a big prog rock fan and classical fan. So I was into kind of the two kinds of music I can think of, which are sort of the most musician-y shit out there. So stuff like, technical dissonant death metal was like sort of the obvious thing that I felt I should be listening to and could obviously relate to. I mean, I just saw such a distinct connection between those things. And yeah, of course, I think it took a second for me to get over death metal vocals, and maybe not even all of them. Certain ones appealed to me from the second I heard them, like Incantation, the first two Incantation records with Craig Pillard on vocals, like immediately thought that was a great vocal style. I remember the vocals on Focus by Cynic, me not liking them at first, and that taking a minute, the kind of more raspy, old school, carcassy, old school death metal style, more high pitched. But yeah, super sort of like low guttural vocals I've always had an attraction to. And I think, yeah, some of the other metal vocal styles took a second for me to warm up to, like even like traditional metal vocals, like, pitched, sort of more operatic singing. I wasn't interested in at first, and now, of course, love.
What attracted you to the recording side?
The recording side of music? I don't know. I suppose I started recording myself and playing music right at the same time. That kind of happened in tandem, and I sort of started playing all the instruments I play at the same time. I have fewer years as a keyboardist and drummer because I spent so long playing guitar and bass in most of my 20s and stuff, when I was really in late teens, when I was really getting good as a musician. But I did start playing all those instruments, drums and keyboards and guitar and bass, and recording all pretty much at 12 or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. I've always been interested in writing my own music and improvising and recording my compositions and my improvisations and listening back to them. Like, that's just always kind of been the point of music to me. So it's never been something where like I came to it out of an interest in something else, or I had an interest in anything technical. I don't really have much of a technical interest, maybe surprisingly.
Technical meaning the equipment side.
I have an interest in instruments, but not like, electronics and fixing things and stuff like that.
Right. Okay. When you're doing those early recordings that you mentioned when you're 12, were you using like an 8-track or something like that?
I was using the Tascam cassette 4-track that I'm literally using again to make a solo album after whatever 35 years or whatever, after it's sitting in a closet and finally getting it fixed. So yeah. I mean, I think the classic story of somebody recording in like the late 80s or early 90s, it's a cassette 4-track. I quickly got the one that I'm using is the more primitive one, but I quickly borrowed one that was a little fancier, that had like a digital timing display. And most of my early recordings I actually did on that 4-track. I was trying to remember the other day which ones I actually made on the one I'm using now. Maybe only my very first recording I did myself, which would have been my second band's first album.
Your second band's first album. Okay.
Yeah, I think that was the one I did on this 4-track. But then, yeah, quickly after like maybe 4 or 5 4-track albums, I was using a DAW. I was using Audio Desk, which was basically digital performer without MIDI. And that was like, when would that have been? Late 90s. Yeah. Like probably 98, 99, something like that.
In terms of recording, I mean, because 12 years old is extremely young, and I don't expect that you had a budget to go into a big recording studio back then. But in terms of your early bands, was taking on the role of recording just purely on the practical side, just to keep costs down and to keep everything in-house?
I suppose so, but I never even thought of it that way. It was like, okay, so my first band, we made 2 recordings and we did them at a quote unquote studio. It was the drummer's dad's friend had a very small basement studio. And since it was his friend's dad, I think, I don't know if we paid for it. I think we just went over and recorded in the basement, probably, as a favor, but who knows? And, that was cool. That was my first experience recording outside of just a cassette boombox recording at home. But I think as soon as I got the 4-track and started doing it myself, I just never considered ever doing it with anyone else ever again. In fact, the only times I've done a record where I wasn't recording myself was the first Dysrhythmia record I played on, which was Barriers and Passages, and the first Gorguts album I played on, Colored Sands, which I still mixed, but I didn't, and mastered, but didn't record the basic tracks for. So yeah, I mean, it's only been in sort of extreme circumstances. Like for the Dysrhythmia one, I had just moved into my basement studio and they had done the previous album with Steve Albini. And I was just like, I couldn't handle the pressure of following that.
Right.
So, but then by the next album, I was recording us and have been doing it since, and, gained some confidence and so on. And the Gorguts thing was because originally we had the idea of doing the entire record with Pierre who had also done Obscura and From Wisdom to Hate. So that made sense. Yeah, go back to the same guy, do the same process as the last two albums. And then we ended up just tracking the guitar, bass, and rhythm guitars, bass, and drums there. And then sort of a couple years went by and we did all the vocal recording and mixing and mastering at my old studio in Queens.
And you actually have a degree in music production, right? Like, I forget what the actual degree is.
I suppose it's called the program I was in was music technology, but it was record all aspects of recording, live recording, studio recording, MIDI, audio for video. And then there were also music classes, piano and singing and music history and stuff like that.
The performance side. Was there a lot of like music theory and stuff like that?
There was music theory. Yeah, there was music theory. There was sight singing. I don't know, maybe 4 semesters of each. I had already had a little bit of that in high school too. So I do have a education in music theory, but I don't have a lot of like instrument lesson years under my belt. I have like 1 year of guitar lessons when I first started playing.
So you had actually, you pursued your degree after you'd already started or had experience recording music. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So basically, I was not interested in going to school, but my parents wanted me to. So the compromise was that I would study recording. Right.
Did the degree or did the classes change the way you thought of recording music?
I mean, for sure they did. Yeah. It was a whole, 4-year college education. It wasn't all recording classes. Like I could have used like 5 times as much of an emphasis on recording instead of it being so varied, but I get that part of the point was for it to be varied and a liberal artsy kind of approach. So I get that. And I think that a certain part of that's cool. I don't think it was worth the cost of going there, but for sure I got stuff out of it. I mean, yeah, it's just like, it was cool, and college is cool and it can be cool, but yeah, it's way overpriced and it was completely unnecessary for what I'm doing with my life. I would have done the exact same thing. And I've only ever worked for myself, so I don't need the degree for anything. So yeah, it was like, I think I view it as a very nice luxury that I got to do that. And I did get some good out of it, but it definitely didn't like change the path of who I think I would have been anyway, in like a major way. I think I still want to end up making my own music and recording it and recording other people for sure.
So I just want to make sure I have the timeline correct. Were you already in Dysrhythmia by the time you were pursuing your degree?
That was after.
I see, okay.
So I went to recording school from 2000 to 2004. So I started Behold the Arctopus like right at the beginning of that.
Okay.
And then joined Dysrhythmia, I suppose, the year I graduated that summer when I moved into my first basement studio. So yeah, so basically joining Dysrhythmia was sort of hand in hand with starting my, career at running recording studios.
Okay. But with Behold the Arctopus, because I remember, even when I was in college, I'm a little bit older than you, but I remember seeing the album and having friends telling me about the band. You were already, I think, well, at least the band was pretty well known in the scene, in the New York metal scene. Were you already making connections of bands that you would either play with or would come record with you?
For sure, yeah. Early on in let's see. Like the very first Behold the Arctopus show was with Pack and Fast Fourier, which was the two guys that later went on to do Grizzly Bear. And Pack are still, good friends of mine, and I recorded their last album, and that's Ron Anderson's long-running band, experimental guitar player. And at the time, the rhythm section for that band was Jesse Krakow and Kim Abrams, who were the rhythm section of Time of Orchids, which was a favorite band of ours to tour with and a favorite band of mine back when I first moved to New York. So yeah, right off the bat, even, I suppose he wasn't in the band at the time, but early in Arctopus's years, we played with Psyopus, and now the current drummer in Behold the Arctopus was in Psyopus. He wasn't in the band when we played with them back then. He joined later, but yeah, a lot of early connections, playing with Dysrhythmia, were made in those days for sure. Mick, I mean, I guess I met Mick in 2001. So that would have been like, yeah, probably right after I started Behold, I met him. And then we wouldn't start playing in Krallice together until 2007, but, which felt like an ocean of time away from 2001. But now in retrospect, that's just 6 years, and these days that goes by like this.
Right. And so, as we go more into depth in your work producing extreme metal albums, I should mention, of the albums that you've produced in the last couple of years, I've spoken to Imperial Triumphant, I've spoken to Defeated Sanity, I've spoken to Andrew Lee from Hokugo Grind Time. I'm buddies with the guys from Grey Skies Fallen and Reeking Aura.
Oh, cool.
I spoke to Meth. Those are all bands that have either recorded at Menegroth or who you had a hand in mixing and mastering their albums.
Yeah, and some good ones in there too.
Yeah. Well, I would I would politely say that they're all good, and I hope they come back.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Like you're mentioning like some of the best.
I realize that a lot of people I think are a little bit naive about what production is and the role that studios and engineers have in capturing sounds. And so I do a lot of nerdy questions about what people go to a Colin Marston or a Greg Wilkinson for. What do you want them to bring to your sound? In your opinion, when people come to you, what are they looking for?
I suppose that's a question for them. I don't always know. Sometimes I know, I guess. Sometimes they'll tell me, we had the album mixed by somebody else and we didn't like it, and we heard an album that you mixed and we liked the sound of it, so we thought maybe we'd try you. So I guess in that sense, I would have, and then I could ask them more specifics about what they didn't like and what they're looking for and blah, 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 and maybe they'd tell me. But other times I have no idea at all. And maybe it's something completely imaginary. I suppose most of the time it's something somewhat imaginary because you never know how it's going to turn out, right? Until it's done. It might not be good. You might not be happy with it. Hopefully that doesn't happen that often. I think most people are happy. But yeah, that's a really hard question to answer, I guess.
Well, without naming names, if you do end up in a situation where you aren't happy with the recording and the band isn't happy with the recording, and presumably, the record company who paid for it is supposed to release it isn't happy with it, how do you proceed from there?
I mean, I guess that basically never happens.
Right.
Like, I feel like unless somebody's lying to me, that's never happened. We've always, done the best we could. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but I feel like usually not liking the sound of a record comes more with time. I don't know if it's like that for everybody, but I think on average it's more like that. Like in retrospect, because like at the time of finishing it, sometimes you don't really have much perspective anymore. You don't even really know what it sounds like. You've heard it too many times. So that's why it's nice to play the record for other people and get their reactions, and why it's, I think, so addictive to hear positive reactions to something you've made, because you kind of don't even know what it sounds like anymore. And hearing that other people like it kind of confirms that it's good like you thought it was when you heard it, like, the 15th time instead of the 150th time.
Yeah.
So, kind of lost my train of thought. Oh, you were talking about like people not being happy. Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like that doesn't happen really often at all, and maybe more in the sense that like you come back and do the next album with me and you're like, okay, I now realize what could have been better about that. Maybe we can try this other snare or this other guitar amp or whatever.
Right. Okay.
I like, it worked on the last album, but in retrospect, yeah, maybe that one thing I used kind of sounds a little harsh, and maybe I could try it this way instead.
So we've begun a conversation about some of the albums that you've worked on. I would like to read this quote to you, or at least reference an interview that you've done in the past where you said that metal is the hardest to mix and it takes the longest to record.
That's totally true.
And it's an opinion that's been expressed on this podcast before. I spoke to Rolly from the band Heath, who's also an engineer, and I forget his exact phrasing, but he said something to the extent of it always sounds like crap. It's really hard to not make it sound like crap. Yeah.
No, it's so funny. It's like with, one band you mentioned you interview with, Defeated Sanity. It's the most intricate music. And they make it even worse for themselves by preferring that guitar sound, which is borderline illegible. So much so that the playing has to be that much better,
Right.
that you can hear anything at all that's going on. And you know, there's obviously some of it comes a little bit gets lost in the whirlwind. And that's
Right.
and that's part of the fun. That's just part of the sound of death metal. But there is a goal, I think, that they have to make it as legible as possible, but still it has to have the brutal sound. And you know, what's not to love about that? But I mean, what an awful challenge for the mixing engineer.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like, you know, this music, which is frequently 220, 240, 260 BPM, constant tremolo picking, constant, you know, 16th notes, constant, you know, there's very little space in the music. You know, everybody's playing as fast as they can all at the same time.
Yeah, everybody's playing all the time, filling up all of the space.
Right. Is that the most challenging part? Like trying to create clarity in this music, which is, you know, almost by definition not supposed to be clear.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of the composite sound tends towards a wall of noise.
Right.
And the music is not a wall of noise. It's very deliberate and detailed music. Even sort of the most straightforward death metal is like pretty detailed and deliberate compared to a lot of other kinds of rock music, right? Like maybe than any other kind of rock music, especially with death metal. So yeah, you want all that work to shine through. And also it's what makes the music compelling and what takes you on a journey is that music compositional sense. And I think that's what relates it a lot to classical music. But it's also sort of very primitive, and often there's just one line that everybody's playing together. You know, it's not super polyphonic like classical music often is. So that's a difference. And that's an advantage. That's actually one reason why, yeah, death metal's really hard to mix, and most metal's hard to mix. But what's harder to mix is really layered music of any kind.
Right. Okay.
And that's another way I torture myself with my own music, is that most of the time in most of the bands I play in, like nobody's ever playing the same thing as each other. And there's exceptions to that. And I'm very aware of that at this point in my life. So a lot of times in my own projects, I sort of fight that impulse. But I have this kind of polyphonic impulse built into me, I think, from a very young age with the prog rock and classical music, that also makes things kind of challenging. It's sort of like death metal's challenging because everybody's playing the same thing and you want to be able to hear everything. But progressive music is challenging because you have a lot of pieces to fit together and you don't want to give too much emphasis to any one of them. You want like the whole orchestra to be heard,
right,
and all the musical lines to have their right weight and nothing to get lost.
Something that I bring up on this podcast a lot was just my early experiences with listening to this music, where, you know, there wasn't a lot of clarity. A lot of stuff was buried, particularly the drums. And by the late 90s, early 2000s, possibly because of technological advances and, you know, the increased use of things like triggers, suddenly there was a lot of clarity, and you could hear every single tom hit. You could hear, you know, every single cymbal fill.
Yeah, now there's too much detail in your average rock and metal mix, for sure. Yeah, way too much detail.
Yeah. Well, was it purely just technology?
No, I think it's a combination of technology and you know, aesthetic trends or whatever you want to call them. Just certain styles in the art form. And, you know, one guy suddenly figures out a way to get the kick drum super clear and even through just a lot of EQ and compression, and then that catches on, and then we find about, you know, triggering samples, and that becomes common, and then you kind of start doing that for everything in the mix. You know, you find ways to easily correct timing, and so of course, why wouldn't you do that? And so yeah, it's just a slippery slope towards having everything more or less sound like a Guitar Pro file or a
right, yeah,
keyboard demo,
Yeah.
which is cool. Like that's the thing. It's like that. I think listening to MIDI files of music is fun, and I love Casio keyboard demos. But the question is what's the intention here? Is it a rock band, or is that part of it totally gone? And it's electronic music.
Yeah. It does sound like as a producer, you prefer the stuff that's more organic and, dare I say it, like more rock and roll, more human.
Well, when it's for a band, yes. When it's for electronic music, then I love the sound of synthesizers and sequencers and all that stuff. It's just, and I'm not saying you can't blur those lines either. Like, yeah, make whatever kind of music you want. But what I don't like is the trend in specifically metal music to have everything sound this hyper detailed, polished, clear sample way. Yeah, I don't happen to like that sound, and I also don't like that it's a trend that just sort of seems to happen to everybody of a certain style. And I like hanging on to, and I know the second you set up a bunch of microphones and mix an album and mic every drum, it doesn't sound the way that it sounds in a practice space. Like that's just out the window when you do that at all. But I like retaining some feeling of that in the records that I mix and record. So to me, the best, I guess what I'm trying to achieve, if I had to say I was trying to achieve something, is to be able to hear everybody in the band and all the musical parts and tell what's going on in the song at any given time, but retain as much of the actual sound of the instruments when they came into the microphone as I can. Obviously EQ and compress and whatever, like process stuff as much as it needs to be processed, but my brain always kind of stops short at a particular place of doing that when it starts sounding too far away from what the instrument sounded like coming in. I think that's kind of what's going on in some aspect of why I make the decisions I make.
something that I bring up a lot on this podcast is the role of the bass in heavy music, because I feel like the bass it occupies a very strange space in, particularly in death metal, where, the guitars are down tuned, you have constant double kick drumming, and the bass is kind of lost in the overlap between the two.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no room. Like, I mean, it's sort of every corner of the frequency spectrum's being taken up by all the instruments at once in a death metal band, and there's just less room to work with low frequencies. We don't hear them as well. They need to be cranked for us to tell what's going on, and you can't layer that many things in the low frequencies and be able to make them all out the way you can with the high frequencies. So I mean, yeah, where's the room left for the bass guitar player in the death metal band? And the answer is there's kind of no room.
Well, let's start with you as a performer and you as a composer. In your role as a bass player, what do you want to bring to, let's say, a band like Gorguts? Like, what is the role of the bass for you?
Oof, that could be a long answer or a multi-part answer. I suppose, like, when I first joined, I had really specific ideas about what the Gorgut sound was and what the instruments were allowed to do. And so Colored Sands was all kind of done with that mentality. And that was because I'd really studied the Obscura and From Wisdom music and to some degree the early stuff, but mostly those two records, and kind of had a really deep familiarity with the ingredients that went into the sound of those albums and was very influenced by them in my own music. Then come Pleiades Dust, that all went out the window, and I didn't give one thought about the writing at all. I just wrote whatever came into my head. And now working on Gorguts again, I feel like it's more like the former. Like there's a little more thought going into what I and Luke want it to sound like. I think, I don't know if you could say that from Luke might express differently from his perspective in the writing, but for me, so there's a little more of a deliberate decision making of like, we're going to do this kind of a thing sort of this time around. And as for what the bass does, I don't know. I think at this point, I'm approaching it pretty intuitively, having had the Lots of Rules album and the No Rules album. I think with the writing of the riffs and the drums and stuff, I'm feeling very like deliberate this time, but with the bass, I'm doing it all very intuitively. And I didn't give you any specifics in there, but let me know if you want some. But
oh yeah, absolutely. Feel free to expand on that.
Well, I suppose, things like, how can I say this? Certain intervals that and chords that I thought were really important to the sound. I wanted to make sure that those kind of came through clearly and that I didn't obscure them. I wanted to make sure that there was like a fair amount of unison between the bass and the guitar early on, even though the bass often splits off and does its own thing. It's closer to the guitars than on Pleiades, which is very polyphonic. So this time around, I'd say it's a little more back and forth between being more unison with the guitars. And the guitars are a little more unison with each other this time around, I think, than last time as well. Also, I think it was important to me to still have like a, kind of like a clear percussive bass sound, even though I'm the only Gorguts bassist to play with a pick. Like all the other bass players were fingers players,
right? Which
kind of really changes things a lot. But I think like still having like an aggressive bass sound, like with the pick, was important to me because that was true of all the other Gorguts bass players. They all kind of had like a really like distinct set. The bass was sort of like always audible and commanding. Even in the first few records, there's a lot of like lead bass moments.
And in your role as an engineer and as a producer, how do you capture the bass? What do you have to do to make the bass be heard? Or does the bass need to be heard?
For my own bass playing, or in general, or both?
In general. I mean, like I spoke to Steve from Imperial Triumphant, and we talked a little bit about what he was looking for in his bass sound. So I think maybe that is a starting point. Like, how do you capture that sound?
I mean, in general, I just do whatever the person wants. So if the person has a really specific idea of what they want, like Steve usually does, I'll just do that. if the person kind of throws up their hands, then I'll kind of, get a sense of what the playing is like and the music is like and so on, and make a suggestion, and then, give them options and stuff. For my own playing, I mean, I have a very specific bass setup I use that involves playing through a bass amp and a guitar amp always together, and using a particular distortion pedal that I've had since I was a kid, like was the first guitar pedal I ever bought.
Right there, Colin, as somebody who was kind of pushed onto the bass, because we already had, in my previous band, we already had two guitarists. And so, I was demoted, I guess. But, the things that you mentioned, playing through a guitar amp, playing through a distortion pedal, and playing with a pick were like my three capital crimes as a bass player. Like I was doing all the things that they tell you not to do.
Right. Yeah, you're playing guitar like a bass player. I mean, bass like a guitar player.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. No, I absolutely play bass like a guitar player. I am not a bass player-y bass player, like even 1%. And I get self-conscious about that, like every now and then, like not that often, but because I think I've made a good job of making the guitar player playing bass thing work. But I mean, it's absolutely 100% what I do. And I overplay and all those things.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not snobby about finger picking versus using a pick. I mean, if it worked for Lemmy, then who's going to argue, right?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, they're both super cool, right? It's just that the fingers has more of the tradition behind it. But yeah, I mean, I think most of my favorite bass players were pick bass players, like or sort of hybrid, like Dave from Neurosis, one of my all-time favorite bass players. He goes back and forth, and just some parts are finger, some parts are pick, and that's kind of the coolest way to do it. Like John Wetton in King Crimson, he was a fingers player, but he would strum the bass a lot and kind of play as if he had a pick and play with distortion and stuff. And then, Chris Squire, just one of the greatest bass players of all time. Like it just the most picked sound you could imagine. Yeah, so that always appealed to me, I think, even from a young age of hearing like the 70s prog, like picked bass was totally accepted in that world. So yeah, I never thought it was weird to, and I think it made it easier to switch between bass and guitar, having sort of started on guitar and then quickly getting a bass, a year or two later, it made that transition between the two more familiar.
So is the idea of playing the bass through a guitar amp as well as a bass amp to get a fuller sound, and so it's not just buried? That
came from the war guitar.
Okay, I see.
Because I got that relatively early on. I got the war guitar when I was 14. So I found, what did I have growing up with the war guitar? I had like an acoustic guitar amp. So basically like a mini PA, which was sort of like a full range thing with a tweeter. And that kind of had this nice crisp sound on the bass strings, like getting all that high treble. And then when I was in school, the amp that they had in all the practice rooms was the Roland Jazz Chorus JC120. And I loved the way the war guitar sounded through that amp, especially the bass register. If it was so bright and crisp and clear and stuff. And so that was one of the first amps I got when I could afford it, right after Arctopus. I was using like a keyboard amp and a bass amp combination. And then quickly I got the Jazz Chorus, and I just loved the sound of that for the bass side. And obviously it doesn't have the low end of a bass amp. So I started pairing it with a bass amp just for the bass side of the war guitar. And that just kind of became this bass sound I loved. And when I started playing the 6-string bass in Dysrhythmia a couple years later, I was just still using that same bass sound with that same distortion pedal into those same two amps.
So the war guitar, for people who aren't familiar with it, and I only personally found out what it is fairly recently, it's kind of a hybrid instrument, right? That uses both bass strings and guitar strings?
Yeah.
Is it a 12-string instrument? Yeah,
the one I have is 12.
Okay, I see. And it's got an extremely thick neck.
He makes anywhere from 5-string to 14-string instruments. And the instrument that it was based on or referencing was the Chapman stick from the 70s, which started as a 10-string instrument, and then they offered a 12-string version pretty quickly thereafter. And my instrument is sort of based on the setup and string and tuning and so on of the 12-string stick. So it has the inverted fifths coming up at you from the middle of the neck for the bass side, and regular fourths going down away from you as the guitar side.
So you've remixed a few albums. I think what comes to mind is the Atheist albums.
I didn't remix them. I did mastering.
I see. Okay. So maybe let's start there, because I personally am not that clear on the difference between the mix and the master. Sometimes I'll speak to a band and, they'll have one guy handle the mix and another guy handle the master, but they'll tell the mastering engineer, make it sound like the mix. And that's always been a strange kind of riddle for me to solve, because it's like, well, the mix already sounds like the mix. Why do you hire another guy to make the mix sound like what it is? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, mastering is probably the most mysterious process to people. I mean, mixing, I think people can probably understand more or less what that is.
Right, yeah.
When you record an album, you're not just recording all the sound in some unalterable way. You're using different microphones and different channels to record everything as separate, independently adjustable layers that during the mix, you then decide how to combine. So that can involve something as simple as just what is the level of the snare drum, the mic on the top of the snare drum relative to the mic on the cymbal, relative to the mic in the corner of the room for the drum kit, relative to the guitar, relative to the vocals. What is the spectral, i.e. EQ balance of all the instruments, and how do those relate to each other? So levels and timbres of all of the constituent parts that you've recorded are combined in whatever way you decide. That's the mix. Mastering can mean many things, but I'd say in most simple terms, in most cases, what you're doing is you're taking the already mixed album with all of those millions of decisions already made, and you're doing a very subtle finishing dusting on at the end to make it sound as good as it can and ready to go for people to listen to. Now, that's a really oversimplified way of putting it, but I think that's not a bad way to start thinking about it if you have just no idea what the hell it is. So to give an example of something I might do pretty often when I master something is I get the mix, which is all the songs as a separate stereo mixed file. I can't go in and change the volume of the drums versus the guitar. I can't change any of that stuff. But what I can do is listen to the total sound of the mix, and I can say, okay, sounds great, but maybe it's a little dark, or maybe it's a little thin. And if it's a little thin, maybe I turn up a certain range of the bass EQ and it sounds a little fuller. And now I've made it sound like the same, just like the mix, but somehow a little bit better. And that bass increase I did is increasing everything in relative proportions by the same amount. So it can't ever have as transformative a process as the mix could have. So yes, the mastering can make a sometimes big difference. It can ruin something at the last minute if you overcook something, over compress or over EQ. And it can make something really sparkle and really sound amazing and killer if it only sounded very good before. It can make it sound amazing, right? Or it can make it sound basically exactly the same. But the mix can have the mix is almost the most important part of the process, I would say, because the recording is super, super important too. But the mix is where you make all the final decisions of what it is, what the song is and what you hear. So you could record 8,000 tracks that you then delete in the mix. So yeah, it was a big thing to record them, but now you don't hear them at all, and it's as if they never existed. So in that sense, I think the mix kind of has the most impact over how something sounds. But obviously the recording is where you're generating the palette that you're then deciding how much of each color to use. So, I'd say mix is most important. Recording is a little bit less than that. And mastering is way, way, way lower than those two in terms of how much impact it has.
And the masters are also specific to the format, right? Sometimes I'll get, review copies that'll be a digital mix and a vinyl mix.
Yeah, that's another part of mastering. And the thing is, traditionally, that's more what mastering was, it wasn't the aspect of sweetening the mix and making it sound even better. It was more just preparing it for the destination format. So if it was going on a 7-inch, you take it from the wax cylinder it's on, and then you transfer it to vinyl or cassettes or CDs or whatever. And sometimes that involves a different audio master, and sometimes it doesn't. And the way I like to master audio is one where you don't do different audio masters for different formats. Some people like to really brick wall limit digital audio, which means you just compress the living fuck out of it, right, yeah, for streaming and CDs. But then for vinyl, it's because it's widely known that results in distortion and doesn't sound good, people won't do it for vinyl. But the thing is, it doesn't make digital audio sound any better either. So it's this weird insecurity that people somehow have and draw the line at for vinyl, because it's too sacred to fuck that up. So yeah, very, very, very strange. But yes, an aspect of mastering is formatting it for the format. So when I do in vinyl master, even if the audio is the same as the digital, it has to be formatted as side A is one file and side B is one file, and then I make a cue sheet which tells you that each song title and what time it begins and ends at, so they can cut the gaps in the groove of the record so you can see where each song starts. Boring stuff like that. Like to make a CD master, you make a particular format and put in a bunch of extra crap if the label wants you to. So yeah, there's the boring sort of office work side of mastering. And then there's the creative part. Sometimes mastering can be really creative. Like this one guy that I work with, who I really like working with, Tim, who does the band Antediluvian, and he plays bass in Revenge when they do shows. He has had me master 2 of the Antediluvian albums. And the last one, the Divine Punishment, he'll do a thing where, interestingly, where he'll record and mix the album super dry, like no reverb on anything, very dry, drums very loud. And he has me in mastering apply like distortion and reverb to the entire mix to kind of like blow it out a little bit and give it like an atmosphere and kind of compress the guitars to make them louder relative to the drums. And the drums are mixed super loud and dry so that when I distort the whole mix, the drums are still really present and they don't get like washed away. So yeah, sometimes it can kind of be an extension of the mix. Sometimes the mastering is really like a crucial part of the sound, but that's pretty rare in my experience.
Sometimes, if I'm correct, people send you, or you reamp their guitars.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So a question that I probably should have asked 10 years ago, and I'm now asking you, is what exactly is reamping, and does it involve an actual amp?
Yes. Or I guess, well, yeah, in my book, yes, although I guess it could just involve software. But I suppose the literal meaning is just that when let's say guitar, because most of the time it's guitars and basses we're talking about here, are recorded, the actual final sound is not recorded, but just the pure direct sound of the guitar is recorded into the recording medium, the computer or whatever. And then after that, that dry guitar signal is run back out into an amp and then mic'd and recorded as if the person is there in the studio with you, but they're not. It's just their file. So the sound that I get is the same sound of just plugging the guitar directly into the computer. Now, I guess you could just slap an amp simulator plugin on that direct guitar track, and maybe that's technically reamping too. And I guess I have even done that sometimes for certain applications, but most of the time, the advantage to reamping is if you're someone who has the ability to record at home, but doesn't really have sonic experience, or maybe doesn't know the sound they want, or you want the convenience of being able to like record guitar over months and months or something and just plug in and have the exact same level every time. You don't have to worry about bumping a microphone and the sound changing. There's all these conveniences of just recording direct that then you can send the file to somebody with a bunch of fancy amps and microphones and get the sound of the studio. So I think it's like a huge money saver for bands that I work with. Often the format that the recording will take is the band comes in, records drums, goes home and records guitar and bass at home, sends me the direct files, and I reamp them here. So it sounds like you did the entire recording in the studio, but really all the time it took to track the guitars, and you can do as many punch-ins you want and take as long and do as many takes as you want. All of that was off the studio clock. It still takes time to set up the reamping and do that, but it's way less time than if the person's there tracking with you. And if they're comfortable recording themselves, there's not that much difference.
So I think everyone, or most of the people listening to this episode, will know that the actual physical location of Metagroth Studios is now closed. The old studio in Queens is closed. Have you started a new studio? Do you have a new location?
I do.
Okay.
I am sitting in the new location as we speak and couldn't be happier. Yeah, I had a solid year with nowhere. Then I hopped from sort of temporary location to temporary location and still did mixing and mastering, but couldn't do any tracking. And yeah, finally found my new spot in May of this year and spent May moving and touring and June setting up and so on, and then back on tour July and August. So now I'm back from the Krallice tour and kind of finally settling in a little more. So yeah, the new Metagroth is alive. There's going to be some renovations to do to put in sort of permanent wiring and renovate a couple rooms for ISO rooms and stuff like that. But I can already record here. I already did a full recording here and also a demo with Gorguts and a bunch of practices. So yeah, it's already going.
Excellent. And you mentioned both Krallice and Gorguts. I believe the news came out a couple months ago that there is a new Gorguts album in the works.
Yes.
Which you spoke about briefly. Do you want to give any updates on that?
Yeah. So it's all pretty much written minus vocals. All the songs are written. Luke's parts, my parts, pretty much all the drum parts. Maybe we're working on one song. I think Kevin's parts are written. We've worked on 4 songs so far together, so we have 4 left to work on. We've got a bunch of practices planned, and not sure exactly when we're going to record at this point, but if I had to guess, it would be like, spring of next year, or, maybe summer at the latest, hopefully. We have a tour in November, so that's slowing things down a little bit, but also Luke takes his time writing vocals, and we still do have 4 songs to arrange, and you never know how long that'll take. So, I think, next year at this point for sure.
Very cool. And you've been extremely prolific. You've got a Bandcamp page with numerous projects. Is there anything you want to plug? Anything coming out before the end of the year that you want people to check out?
My releases have very much slowed down since I moved out of the studio. I just had a couple solo albums last year. But yeah, so Krallice is recording soon, but we're just doing 2 songs. So that won't be an album, but it'll be some sort of EP. And working on new stuff. Yeah, the Gorguts record, but that probably won't be, for a while. I'm working on a new album right now for one of my solo projects, Earth Shroud. That's what I'm doing on the 4-track cassette. That's like a black metal solo project of mine. And yeah, now that I'm finally back in the studio, I'm really looking forward to getting back to a lot of my recording projects like the solo record. I didn't have it in me over the last year to do a lot of stuff like that. And yeah, Dysrhythmia, I want to get that band practicing again. I have some ideas for what I want to do with Behold, but yeah, I obviously need time to kind of develop the sound I want to try for that and see if I can get everybody together to work on that stuff. Yeah, in terms of like web presence, I've never been a social media person, and I still don't have any social media. But I do have that Bandcamp page. It's Colin Marston Omnisound. And that has links to all of my musical project pages. And then all the albums on the Colin Marston Omnisound are like more of the kind of obscure projects. Like, Krallice has its own Bandcamp, Gorguts has its own, Behold has its own, and so on. But all the stuff that's sort of native to the Colin Marston Omnisound are the kind of a lot of the newer projects that I've started since 2020, more experimental projects, a lot of solo projects, black metal, electronic stuff, a lot of really fun, interesting stuff in there if people are curious. And pretty much everything on there, I also put on my YouTube channel, which is, I think, just if you just search I don't know if you just search Colin Marston or if it's also Colin Marston Omnisound. It's one or the other. But I put up all my new releases there, and then some other, funny odds and ends, humorous things. And then I guess like all of my actual bands like have social media pages. Just I'm not involved in them.
Right. And as far as your work as an engineer.
Oh, in the studio, I think you said before, but the studio website is the1000caves.com. It's currently out of date. It has the old studio up, but I'm probably just going to keep the same website and then just eventually update the site, once I get photos and stuff of the new place. And also keep an eye out because I will be doing a fundraising campaign at some point. I have 2 rooms in the new studio to like do a gut renovation of and turn into isolation rooms. The new place is great, but it's like it was previously like a store. Whereas the last place I was a studio. It was like a studio before it was my studio. So there's no sound isolation between any of the rooms here. So to put in actually isolated rooms to record loud amps and stuff is going to be a very expensive construction project. So I will be doing some kind of a fundraiser for that in the coming months that people should try to keep an eye out for.
Very cool. And once that the fundraiser is public, I'll share it on the Doc Tumblr page.
Awesome.
Colin, this is the 400th episode. It's been incredible finally getting a chance to speak to you about, all these things.
Oh man, I got 400. That's sick.
You are number 400, man. And
amazing.
You follow in the steps of Greg Wilkinson and Scott Burns.
Two engineers that I love. And Greg is actually a good friend too. That guy rules. And
you've been extremely generous with your time, but is there anything else you want to say? Anything else you want listeners to know about?
Oh, no, not that I can think of. Yeah, thanks a lot for the questions and the time and the good conversation.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Colin.
Cheers.